Hello and welcome. My name is Samantha Donaldson. I'm the Vice President of Communications at the Partnership for Public Service. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Partnership, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicated to building a better government and a stronger democracy. We achieve this mission by focusing on three areas of work. The first is helping government to recruit, engage, and retain the nation's top talent. The second is equipping federal leaders to effectively achieve their agency's mission and contribute to the public good. And the third way is ensuring that society trusts and engages with a well-functioning government. We all know that trust in government is at near historic low. And while low levels of trust and understanding are cause for concern, they also provide an opportunity to shift perspective positively to reshape the public's attitude and relationship towards government for the better. Today's conversation is going to dive deeper into this issue and share the how, why, and what people are thinking about our democracy and government, as well as the indications for how government can begin to rebuild trust with the public. I'm thrilled to have Nat Kendall-Taylor, CEO of Frameworks Institute, joining me today in this discussion. Nat and I are going to each give you a brief overview of our respective organizations' research and findings on government and democracy. We'll then join Margaret Tilleff in a conversation. Margaret is the Kramer Director of the Syracuse University Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, which is a joint effort between the Newhouse School and the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Margaret joined Syracuse University earlier this year after an illustrative 30-year journalism career that spanned covering American politics and the White House. She continues to serve as an Axios contributor and an analyst for CNN. Margaret, we're really looking forward to the conversation later, but before we get to that, Nat, I'm going to turn it over to you to share Framework Institute's findings and research.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha and Margaret. It's really great to be with you as well. And everybody who's on with us, really looking forward to having this time with you. Like Samantha said, I'm going to get through about 10 minutes of our findings, turn things back over to Samantha, and then we can get to the really interesting and kind of engaging and provocative part, which is where Margaret's going to ask us really tough questions. But just first of all, can I introduce myself a little bit? I'm a psychological anthropologist by training. And I've spent the last 20 years of my career studying how culture influences the way that people think, how people use culture frequently without knowing it to formulate opinions, to process information and make decisions. And I lead an organization called the Frameworks Institute, which does two things: studies cultural mindsets, what I'm going to be talking about with you today, and then looks at the way that our communications shape, shift, expand, create room in those mindsets for new discussions and for the consideration of new solutions. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a few select findings from a much larger project that we've been running since May 2020, which kind of started in response to a lot of the claims that we were getting from our partners that culture was changing early on in the pandemic in deep and forever ways, that America was becoming kind of more preventative in its orientation. I don't think so. Less racist in its ideology, probably not. And so we thought that this was a really interesting set of questions for us to use our kind of training and methods as social scientists to be able to answer. So we started back in May 2020 to ask a series of questions. Are cultural mindsets, and I'll tell you what cultural mindsets are in a minute, are they changing? If so, how are they changing with respect to particular social policy issues like government, democracy, the economy, and for whom are we seeing those changes kind of in a most pronounced way? And then importantly, what are those implications for people like you all on the call who are trying to kind of do social change work, that are trying to engage Americans with new ideas and move forward. So we've used, I'm not going to get into methods. If people have methods questions, I would love to answer those during the Q&A, but we've been using kind of a first of its kind quantitative monthly culture tracking survey. We've also been doing focus group research and what psychological anthropologists call cultural models interviews, kind of in-depth one-on-one conversations with people to try to get at all of the ways that they have available and accessible to make sense of these issues. And so the project, I've said this now, this term a number of times, I'll now quickly explain what I mean. Cultural mindsets are these deep implicit, in other words, we use them without knowing it. They're kind of below the level of conscious consideration, ways of understanding the world. They shape how we see the world, and importantly, how we act and make decisions in that world. And then really significantly for our conversations, when we get into the discussion part of our time together, the choices that we make and how we communicate have the power to activate certain of these cultural mindsets and deactivate others, which is really the key to kind of pulling alternative perspectives to the forefront and opening space for more kind of deliberate and considerate conversations. We're looking at 3 mindsets in the Culture Change Project. I'll be talking probably mainly about one of these today, but the first is individualism, the sense that the world is the way that it is, kind of as an exclusive result of how hard people try, grit, gumption, drive, willpower, all this stuff, kind of good old classic John Wayne, Jay-Z bootstraps thinking. Not that thinking is wrong, but we're interested in it because of the powerful way that it occludes consideration of other things that shape outcomes, like government, like resources, like policies, like the assets or lack thereof that are available in communities. Second, the mindset of fatalism. This is the kind of growing sense, which is attached really strongly, and I think, and we're going to see this in some of Samantha's findings, is used to think about government, the sense that the world is too gone, problems are too numerous, too deep, too dark, too dire and on fire for us to do anything about. And therefore, when presented with another one, our easy and quick reaction is to tune out and move on. And last but not least, a sense of otherism, this very quick and immediate way that we have of seeing issues in zero-sum terms. This is also really important in our conversation today. Ways of looking at kind of any more resource for they, them, those people over there. I'm using my pronouns really intentionally, by definition, means less for me and my people over here. And so I'm going to use my remaining time to talk to you very quickly about 3 findings that are coming out of this larger project, which I think are of relevance to all of you on this call, people who are working on government, kind of role in government, building trust and faith in government, and people focusing kind of maybe slightly differently on issues of democracy, but in a related way. So the first finding is related to that individualism that we've been talking about. So individualism is kind of one mindset, but it's counterbalanced by a sense of what we're calling systems thinking here, the kind of sense that what surrounds us shapes us, which is an available mindset in American culture. And one of the most interesting things out of the Culture Change Project is that we are seeing some real flux between the balance of people's thinking in individualistic terms and people's ability to entertain more systems mindsets. We're seeing that in different ways across issues. I'm going to tell you quickly about how we're seeing that on racism and the economy here. When it comes to racism, on the individual side, we're kind of interested in what's kind of sometimes called the individual animus, or the interpersonal model of racism, that racism exists kind of in the hearts and minds of a few evil and wicked people. On the system side, we're interested in a more kind of structural perspective on racism. And when we started this work in May 2020, this was kind of where, in aggregate, this is where kind of public thinking was. Really interestingly, over the last 3 years, we've seen that dot slide in a much more kind of balanced position between these poles of individualism and interpersonal racism and structural racism on the other side. We are seeing, interestingly, like from the most recent research, we're seeing this kind of reach a plateau and not sliding any ways significantly further towards the right-hand side of the screen here. But some really interesting changes that, frankly, we have not seen in the 20 years that we've been looking at and working on issues of racism. When it comes to the economy, we're interested in this idea kind of on the individualism side of kind of bootstraps thinking and market naturalism, that the economy is this natural force of nature. And then on the more systemic side, the idea that the economy is a designed system that is the product of intentional decisions that we make, that government makes, that kind of shape our economic system. This one, kind of the balance began relatively in the middle when we started this work in May of 2020. But interestingly, we've seen this one slide a considerable way towards that more kind of ability to recognize the economy as a design system. Most recently, I'd say like over the last year, 6 months, there's a really interesting dimension here where, I hope everybody saw that dot move. That took me about 40 minutes to make that happen. This mindset seems kind of particularly sensitive to political things that are going on. So certain pieces of policy that have been in play, and kind of people's thinking seems to be particularly tied and sensitive to kind of current political and policy discussions. So the opening here is the so what is that I think there is kind of this really interesting opening for a more robust conversation about the role of government, given that I think kind of government is the systems actor in our society, in our country, and in a way that's different from May 2020 and certainly before that, that there is this opening for people to see how government actions, government decisions are affecting the lives of individuals and group outcomes. And again, probably particularly attuned and sensitive to things that are going on the economic front. But, and there's always a but after these kind of openings and productive things, the but is that we are also simultaneously seeing people's thinking about government be incredibly personalistic in nature. And what I mean is that when you engage people in qualitative and open-ended conversations about government, they inevitably focus on the few leaders at the top, and they're not seeing all of the way that services are provided and that government touches the lives of all of us on the daily. And so what this does is it leads to a very specific solution. When you turn this conversation to solutions, people easily, persistently, quickly, and predictably focus on getting those bad politicians out and getting the better ones in. What is much harder to see thinking through this mindset are any changes to structures, any changes to the way that government works at kind of a rule and policy level. And the so what here is that I just talked about people maybe seeing, kind of maybe open to seeing how systems affect their lives, but they don't see government as a system, which I think is fascinating. And so the recommendation or the idea to think about, to play with, is can we find ways of activating that systems mindset that we're seeing on other issues, the economy and racism, and kind of bringing it into the way that people think about government. And third and last, some interesting findings. We've had a number of conversations with people in our focus groups about the Constitution, and are finding, this is, I mean, anytime I get the chance to alliterate here, I have to, some kind of cracks in people's faith in the Constitution. So an increase compared to research that we've done in the past and that other social scientists have done, which has kind of shown traditionally kind of almost a blind faith and an unquestioned trust in the Constitution, moving towards a much more robust critical perspective on the Constitution, the recognition that the Constitution has shortcomings, but the conversation kind of ends there. So not a lot to no consideration of this idea that the Constitution is changeable. And so the so what there, I think, is the importance, the idea of moving into this openness of thinking about the Constitution as a document, as a set of rules that have shortcomings, but doing so with some pretty specific and explicit explanations of how changes can be made in that system. And so I'm going to end my time. Can't believe I did that on time. I thought there was no chance I was getting through that in 10 minutes with, I always like to end with a quote. This is kind of a really nice way of thinking about cultural mindsets from Walter Lippmann, who was a writer, a political commentator, a communications scholar, who said that the way in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what people will do. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Samantha.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that really interesting and important research. And I love the so what's. And I think, as you said, really builds on nicely on some work that the partnership's been doing over the last 2 years. So if we can pull up the slides, just want to start, Nat, you mentioned a lot of this in your comments, but if we scope out and look at government as an institution, we're really at an inflection point as a country. And if we can go to the next slide, please. As we've been saying, public confidence in our federal institutions is near historic lows. And the partnership's research found that only 35% of Americans trust government to do what is right, at least some of the time. Our nation, as we all know, is facing ongoing threats to democracy and misinformation. And, as we see those challenges, we're also seeing new expectations for our government are evolving rapidly. And there's these new historic investments and major policy initiatives that need effective government, as Nat alluded to. And this lack of trust is really just having a harmful effect on our nation's ability to meet our challenges of today and tomorrow, to recruit talent, and to implement these once-in-a-generation investments in infrastructure, climate resiliency, and equitable economic recovery. And for the partnership, we see without trust, the government cannot be this effective partner to the public. So in 2021, the partnership embarked on an initiative to understand how people in the United States feel about their federal government. And as Nat, his earlier slide said, we wanted to look beyond the politics of the day and the leaders in Washington, D.C. We really wanted to focus our national surveys and our research on the parts of government that are often out of the political limelight, the federal agencies and the 2 million civil servants who work across the country and around the world. Our research also investigates why people do or don't trust government. There's several surveys that have measured level of trust over time, but they really provide insight into the drivers of trust and the specific sources for changing expectations of our government. And these current challenges that we're facing as a country require really more than knowing that trust is on the decline. We really need to understand how people feel about the government and why they feel that way. And so through our research, we found 3 key drivers of distrust for the federal government. The first is the perceived or real examples of government serving some communities better than others. And on the slide, you can see a few data points that reinforce this driver of distrust. The second is a belief that government is inefficient and ineffective. Probably won't come to a surprise to any of you, but 75% of respondents said that the government's too bureaucratic and also wasteful. Almost as many have stated it's corrupt at 69%, while 59% it was incompetent. And then the third driver of distrust, and this gets to what Nat alluded, is negative personal experiences with our government. While more people said their personal experiences with the federal government were positive, 48%, those who had a negative personal experience, so imagine a really long, onerous form that you're trying to fill out to get a benefit, or waiting super long on a phone line to get a question answer about your taxes. Those instances really were a significant factor in their overall trust of government. We can go to the next slide, please. So as I shared, and as Nat also made the point of, for many members of the public, the key associations when you ask about government, the federal government, are politics and politicians, which are perceived very negatively. So members of Congress, for example, are only seen favorably by 30% of the public, compared with 61%. However, when people start focusing on agencies and their missions and services, as well as non-elected officials, so civil servants, and those who work in public service, more positive attitudes surface. So we can go to the next slide, please. So this is where the good news is. There is good news out there. So for many members, of the public, people and institutions are viewed very favorably. We asked a list of 13, recognizable agencies, and 12 out of 13, said that they had favorable views of those agencies. So those included the National Park Service, the EPA, energy, so really high favorabilities when you drill down and talk specifically about federal agencies and their mission. Public servants, civil servants also had very high favorability. We heard from those that identified as Democrats, Republicans, independents. They viewed civil servants as competent, hardworking, dedicated, and understood the work that they were doing that contributed to their overall country. And the third, was a way that's good news here, is how the stories of our government can help be a light bulb in helping to shift perceptions. So we can go to the next slide, please. So there's the opportunity to rebuild trust. As I shared, there is overwhelming support for our nation's 2 million civil servants and the work that they do. So focusing on their competence, their dedication, how they're serving the public. There is also high support for a merit-based, nonpartisan civil service. So there's opportunities here to focus on that in effort to rebuild trust. We go to the next slide, please. As Nat shared and as I've talked about, there's also stories. How do we make government more personal? When we shared examples of some of our Service to America Medals honorees, these are individuals the partnership honors through an annual program who are career civil servants. When we shared examples of, a young person working at the CDC to help solve the opioid crisis, or another, individual helping to keep our water safe working at the EPA, you saw real shifts in how people viewed our government. You saw them going from this government is bureaucratic, they're in DC, to people saying, I didn't realize our government did this work. I didn't realize they could be my friend or my neighbor. This is making me feel differently about the way our government shows up and operates. And then the third opportunity really here to rebuild trust, if we can go to the final slide, please, is really around that personal experience. As Nat talked about, and I think is a big focus of this, this is a focus of this administration on how do we improve the customer experience? How does government provide better services to the public in a more equitable way? And, you'll see on this slide, there was, high, strong perceptions and favorability for some common interactions. You saw that people were overwhelming, had positive reactions to applying to Medicaid or Medicare benefits, to filing their taxes, to getting a passport. But as I shared earlier, it's when that negative interaction happens, that's when trust starts to get diminished. So how can government be a better partner in delivering those services to the public? So that's a nice overview. As Nat said, we got through a lot of information, but now I'm excited to turn it over to Margaret to moderate a conversation with Nat and me about these findings. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so please ask them in the chat, and to the extent you feel comfortable, please include your name, your location, or your organization, just so we understand, the perspective that you're bringing to the conversation. So Margaret, over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sam. Thanks, Nat. And thanks to all of you who are watching from around the country. I am anxious to get to your questions, but I'd like to kick off with a couple of my own. To both of you, your surveys taken in recent months, they're very fresh. They really look at this from two different lenses. One is kind of the macro society, what's going on in society, and how could that impact perceptions of government. The other is asking the more direct question about how people feel about government. So you get the macro and the more focus. I guess I'd like to start just by asking each of you, first Nat, then Sam, did anything surprise you in your findings? And if so, what was the biggest surprise to you, your assumptions based on what people said?
Love the surprise question. And any research that doesn't have surprises is like not good research, in my opinion. I don't know. There's always surprising things. So to me, that final finding that I talked about, kind of cracks in constitutional faith, was pretty surprising. There's a fairly robust literature that has kind of demonstrated that people view the Constitution as this like sacred and off limits thing. And the fact that some of the conversations, and interestingly, in those conversations, it was primarily about the Supreme Court and the Electoral College were the things that people focused on. And these weren't just kind of like policy wonks. These were what we call RPs, real people talking about these things, which I think is really interesting, that kind of those ideas have found their way out into the public discussion in ways that are leading people to question and see some fallibility in the Constitution. So that's one for sure. And I guess the other one is something that I didn't talk about today, which is really directly related to what Samantha was talking about. So we have these series of questions that try to determine the relative balance, or kind of the position of that dot along a different continuum, which is on one end, this mindset of, which is incredibly dominant and easy to elicit, kind of government as inept, as corrupt, as skullduggerous, whatever word we want to use there. And on the other end, this idea of government as kind of responsive partner. And we know that both of those ways of thinking are available in our culture. They're not equally available. They're not equally available to all people, all groups, based on some of the factors that Samantha talked about. But one thing that I thought was really surprising is that when we started this research, I thought that dot was going to be and was going to be and stay like all the way over here on that skullduggerous position. But what we found is that it's surprisingly more balanced than you would think. Now, there's an important caveat, is that in this question, we are asking about the future. So do you think government will always be inept and unable to do the things that we need it to do, versus do you think government can and should be more responsive to meeting the needs of the country? And it was really surprising that the balance between those perspectives. And I do think that's a key difference between what Sam's talking about and what we're talking about, is that kind of future orientation, is that position is much more balanced between those perspectives than I would have predicted. And I think that's something interesting to consider.
Before I go to Sam, do you know why? What is it that's giving people that for? Is it COVID related? Is it something technological? Why would people almost have an optimistic outlook?
Yeah, so again, just to caveat, people aren't saying that government is doing that. That would have been a really different question, and you would have gotten findings like the ones that Samantha talked about. I think it is related to kind of the last 3 years of our lives in this country, and how we have seen again and again both opportunities where government hasn't lived up to the responsible role that we hope and need it to be in, and a select few cases where government has been responsive. The child tax credit is something that comes up again and again in our work. Various major pieces of policy that were introduced to respond to crises that we've been living through. And so I think it's both like the obvious and overt failures and the select but visible successes where government has been responsible that I think are provoking and kind of causing that more balanced perspective than what we thought would be there.
Thanks. Sam, I have a question I'm dying to ask you, but let's do the one I promised to ask you first. What was the biggest surprise finding to you?
And this might go to your question, I don't know. So I think the biggest surprise to me was views about civil servants. So, particularly in our most recent poll, which we fielded in November of 2022, I wasn't surprised to see the favorability from those that identified as Democrats, but those that identified as Republican, and I should say we focused really those who identified on center right, center left, and independent. There was high favorability among those identified as Republicans around the views of civil servants, with 60%. And I think there's this bigger narrative happening about who these people are. There's been, talk of politicizing the civil service. And, this was surprising to me to not see further divide between Democrats and Republicans, and a good thing. Like, it made me feel better that sometimes, like, what the larger narrative we make here in DC is actually maybe not the case that's happening around the country. So that was something that surprised me from our findings the past kind of 2 surveys.
Okay, so I want to delve into partisan splits in a minute. The question that that piqued my interest was, you said 12 out of the 13 agencies were viewed more favorably than unfavorably. I've got a secret guess, but I want to know what the answer is, and then I'll tell you if it's what I guess. What's the one that's what's the one that's underwater?
It's probably no surprise it's the IRS, but it wasn't so underwater. I know. But, and they've had a great tax season and being more responsive, with the investments that are being made. But there's room. Like, their underwater was less, I think I want to say it was like 48 less or 58 or something like that. So there is some room. Like, it's not a huge divide that they have to climb to get out of there. So I'm sure that probably was on your bingo card.
It is the reason that it's underwater the same reason why it's always been underwater, because nobody wants to get audited and people hate paying taxes? Or is it because there has been a concerted argument in recent years to try to say, and it's a partisan argument to try to say, the IRS needs less money, not more, because they're they're unfairly investigating you. Is that taking hold, or is it more of a stasis kind of a situation?
So we didn't go through the layers down to see exactly what was driving the unfavorability of the IRS. But if I step back and look at the data from the overall surveys and make some, findings here, it's that I think, again, going back to the personal interaction, right? So I think for a long time, as you said, the IRS has been starved of resources. So they haven't been able to invest in the technology they need and that the public expects, right? To file their taxes, to improve their customer experience, so to reduce wait times, to reduce how long you're waiting to get your tax refund, you know, to really be the responsive that you need to the public. And then I think, you know, there probably is, you know, the views of, there could be views driving at the IRS, which has been politicized over the years. Is that workforce more political? Those would be some of the examples, you know, that, you know, might be just based on our larger reset, driving some of that negativity of the IRS. And I should say, I have the data just so I can share that the unfavorability was 42% were favorable to the IRS compared to 51. So it's not a huge gulf for them to have to get better, you know, on the positive end of the favorability. And the TSA, for example, is 55% positive with 27% negative. So I think, you know, again, these are frontline agencies serving the public every day. And so I think people feel it when things aren't working well.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Americans are not a monolith. You can look at overall trust numbers and they tell you something, but the splits are what tells you the real story. So let's talk a little bit about the splits. What are the biggest splits, especially around the ideas of trust in government, responsiveness of government? Is government meant to take care of people like me? Is age a bigger driver? Is race and ethnicity? Is it gender? Is it education? Or is it party ID?
So gender, from our research, we haven't found is not a significant factor in how much people trust the government. You know, male are slightly more likely to have trust than females, but the difference is insignificant. But for us, you know, political affiliation is really what's driving the differences, you know, and probably not surprising. So Republican males and Republican females trust the government at almost the same rate. So 21% of Republican males trust the government in our surveys versus Republican females, which is 25%. And then male Democrats are more likely to trust the government than female Democrats. We're also seeing people, and again, probably not surprising, 65 and older trust the government more than people ages 18 to 34, but that's 42% to 30%.
So I really want to go back to what you said and just underscore that for anyone who's watching this, because whether it's 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5, a really minority of Republican respondents to this survey are saying they trust government. Basically 1 out of 5 men, 1 out of 4 women. Like, those are terrible numbers. How do you message to, how do you focus the responsiveness efforts or the messaging efforts on people of a particular political affiliation? And Nat, I want to bring you back into this conversation because some of this really is beyond people's interactions with government, and it goes to the broader questions of American culture and queuing.
So I'll share a few things, and then I want to make sure, Nat, you get in there just quickly. So, you know, it's right. I do believe there are messaging challenges our government has to overcome. And when we did different message testing and storytelling, we saw shifts most starkly between those that identified as Republican in favorable direction. So again, when you told stories of here's an accomplishment by this agency or this person, really positive shifts about how those that identified as Republican saw their government. I should also say, you know, Nat talked about systems, and there's systematic reforms that need to take place no matter the party. You know, overwhelmingly, people want our government to be more accountable and transparent, right? There is reforms at the system level that need to take place. The government is more responsive to the public, and that was across the party. And I think they need to see government showing up in a way where they're solving major problems in this country. You know, how are they showing up and protecting our security, our public health? And that's across any party ID, but that gets some more to the systematic reform that needs to take place that we have the government that we need and deserve as a public. And Nat, I'll let you jump in here to add more from your work.
Yeah, so I think it's not surprising. It's great when research says the same thing, but I mean, our findings are largely the same thing. So when it comes to that individualistic or individualism and systems thing, its gender is really insignificant, surprisingly, although less so when it comes to racism. Race and ethnicity is not, and the two driving factors, Margaret, are the two that you've talked about. So party ID, and I guess surprisingly equal, if not more significant, is generation, is age, where you see these really kind of neat as in tidy, not neat as in cool, kind of stepwise functions, where kind of the older cohort you get, the more individualistic you get on those issues. I do think, and your question leads there, Margaret, it's kind of this combination of like what's to be done is a combination of, as Samantha was saying, like actually improving the way that government affects people's lives. So better implementation, better delivery. But there is also a framing, messaging, narrative component of this, which is about kind of the way that we talk about this work. And in work that was done a long time ago by frameworks on role of government, the most significant finding of that work is kind of when you test three different frames, when you kind of test a government, as government in the messenger slot, kind of politicians, or whether you talk about services. The first two of those absolutely bomb. Like people, you hear that and people do not become more supportive of government. But when you make that shift to talking about services and agencies, I mean, this is directly in line with what Samantha is saying, that's where you see the shifts. So it's related to that personalization of politics finding that I said, like, that is the challenge. And what we need to do is counteract that with consistent, persistent stories about what government does. But we can't forget the fact that at the same time, we need to improve what government does, right? This is not just a communications and narrative intervention. There is an implementation intervention that needs to come along with this.
There's a great deal of overlap between geography and party ID. There's a correlation. Metropolitan areas are more heavily blue, rural areas are more heavily red, and suburbs tend to be the more swing areas. I don't know if you have the numbers at your fingertips, so sorry for the pop quiz, but at least broadly speaking, how does that urban, suburban, rural overlay fit with trust in government, the feeling the government is responsive, the government's necessary?
I need to look into that data. I know when we were looking, we oversampled by different regions. So we wanted to make sure, that government is across the country and not just in DC. I remember interesting that we saw the greatest opportunity for shifts in public perception in the American West, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's where we saw opportunities for, where people, might have low levels of trust, but they were open to shifting how they trusted government and shifted to how they could perceive government. And I found that really interesting.
Do you know why that is? Is that because of fires or climate concerns? Is it because of some of the kind of natural resource challenges that places in the West are facing? Or is it because of technology evolution in the West? Like, do we know why?
We didn't get down to that level of granularity of like what is driving this, but I think everything you say, Margaret, makes sense to me. Again, it goes back to how are people personally interacting with government? And you're right, a lot of wildfires, the technology, a lot of disasters. And I think maybe they can see how government is showing up or not showing up, and gives that, opportunity potentially to change how they're perceiving government. To your point, I got some more data here, but small town and rural areas were more negative on trust in government versus urban and suburbs. And likely it was tied to partisanship, but we don't know for sure. So I think, your assumption at the beginning, small town rural areas were more negative in their views about government and trust versus the urban areas. But that's something I think we want to continue to dig into.
Right, because then it becomes a chicken and the egg question. Is it a matter of, is it a function of where you're living and what you need from government? Or is it a function of the media you're consuming because of your party ID and how that's cueing you, right? I mean, I think that chicken and egg question is really crucial to sort of untangling the answers to some of these questions. Nat, I want to bring you into this before we go to questions. And I also hope that some of the questions that we're lining up in queue, will please, if you can, if it's not too late, add kind of where you're from, or at least what part of the country you're from. I think that might give us a non-scientific sample of what you might be interested in, depending on where you are. But, I want to ask you, two things, because these are both changes in society. One is kind of AI and technology. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, does the emerging AI trend and all the things that come with it, dehumanization, misinformation, making it harder to know whether what you're seeing is real or not. Do either of you guys see any signs yet of how that's impacting trust in government and what people need from government? And then I guess the other thing I want to ask you both is, like everything else, is there increasingly a demand for people who are hired to government jobs to be technically skilled, to have a specific technical skill that they're bringing to the job with them, or can people still learn on the job as they always have in bureaucracy?
We ended with a couple doozies there, Margaret. Thank you. I'll maybe try the first one, and Samantha, I have no ability to answer the second one, so you can take it or not, as you'd like. But I think, Margaret, there's like a hypothesis that's behind your AI and tech and government question, which I think is really interesting. We're actually doing some work on the social implications of artificial intelligence that's kind of getting at some of this. And I think, surprise, surprise, I think some of this is a framing question. And so we've seen in our work where when AI is framed as something that government is misusing, i.e. is using that is furthering inequities, like the use of predictive policing or pretrial algorithms, that activates this really powerful mindset of system is rigged, which when that attaches to government is incredibly toxic for the kind of goals that we're talking about. There's another way of framing the AI conversation, which instead of use of, its protection from, and it's kind of a corporate malfeasance kind of frame. And I think you do get dramatically different discussions when the conversation is framed in those two different ways. So I don't know if that answered your question at all, but I think clearly the AI discussion and discourse is rubbing up against people's thinking about government in some really interesting ways. And I think there are opportunities and projects that we have and others are doing kind of in the communications and framing world where we're going to learn a lot more about that connection as we go forward.
Sam?
Well, I'll add to Nat's and then answer your question about, what government needs in terms of talent. So we did ask about misinformation, and we found that nearly 50% of people that we surveyed said misinformation is keeping civil servants from doing their jobs. Probably not a surprising finding, but that's a large finding. But on your point about what government needs, I think it's twofold. Government does need technologists and other, cybersecurity specialists and tech talent to come in and help it, become more accountable, more transparent, deliver the services in the way that we, as the public expect, right? Like we can get anything on our phones now. Drones are delivering things. Like we need government to evolve, and it needs the talent to help it. But there's also people in leadership positions that need to understand how this technology works, right? So they don't need to be the technologists, but they need to understand so that they're leading the workforce and they can help lead the strategy of the future. At the partnership, 5 years ago, we launched an AI program, leadership program for the top leadership executives, career executives, the senior executive service, so that they could learn about AI. And these aren't, again, technologists or people in chief technology officer roles. And, in the past year, the demand for this program has surged. So I think people understand AI is here, government needs to learn. And again, it doesn't need to be left to the CTO, CIO offices. This is something that as all leaders, we need to understand how we can use it and meet the moment that government has.
Great. I'm gonna.
Can I say one more thing really quick,
Yes.
Margaret, just to connect? I promise it'll be quick. But I think this conversation kind of actually goes back and connects with some of the things that you were saying before, Samantha, whereby kind of government's role in regulating, protecting, whatever verb we want to use there on AI is one of those services that we can kind of put in front of people and remind them and kind of be useful as a framing strategy to shift from kind of focus on specific political leaders to focus on what government, at least what government needs to do. And I think there's like, clearly the AI discussion is a complicated one, but I think that there's some promise and potential in that as a way of really kind of bringing government services and responsive government into the conversation in a different way.
Great. So I'm going to begin to move to questions. I have a couple more questions in my pocket, but I'd like to get to some in our audience. So I may salt these through in between. If you haven't yet and you want to submit a question, please go ahead and do that. If you feel comfortable sharing your name, that's great. If you want to say what part of the country you're from or what field you're in, that's great also. And we will get to them in short order. I'm going to start with a question from Cindy Olnick. Sam, this is toward you. Although Nat, obviously, please jump in also if you can see how it applies to your research. But Cindy asks, can you clarify what the discrepancy was between the negative and positive perceptions of people's personal experiences with government? In other words, did those perceptions become more positive after people heard or read the stories about civil servants, or did they become more negative?
No, great question. Thank you, Cindy. Yes, so, as I shared, there were positive interactions with people when they had services with government. So whether that's applying for a passport, your taxes, calling Social Security for questions about your benefit. But as I shared, as soon as someone had a negative interaction or they knew a neighbor, a family member who did, the trust started to decline. This really started to be a driver of why they weren't trusting government. And so the work that we did, to really try to unpack those drivers and show stories of public servants and to explain, this is what this person did at the EPA, for example, or this is how this person is showing up at the State Department to keep you safe. That's when you did see to start shifting perceptions. People understood, to Nat's point, personalization. People put a face with the story. People could identify that this was someone like them who's working hard every day. We also saw that it was important with keywords like that. We were demonstrating that government was empathetic, that it was listening, that it was dedicated. These were words that really started to shift perceptions across both political affiliations. And we found that focusing on, national security, public health, and sustainability were really areas where positive shifts would happen across different party IDs. Nat, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, I think you got it. Thank you, though, Samantha.
So we have another question from Jennifer Horton. Jennifer asks, in thinking about, this is a question about differentiating between different things for different people. In thinking about how you would operationalize some of this information, what kind of qualitative data do you have around the findings? In other words, people might agree on the idea that government isn't working, but they might have totally different ideas about why they feel the government isn't working. So how you would move the needle might need to be individualized. What does the data tell you, and how do you think about actually operationalizing those kind of broad sentiments where the details matter?
I'll start on that one if that's okay, Samantha, and then make sure that you get a chance to think while I talk and then give the real answer. So to me, this is a great question, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. And to me, this is kind of the connection between those three drivers that Samantha talked about and kind of where my brain goes as someone who's wants to go out and test frames to kind of, like you're saying, operationalize that. So the three drivers were kind of examples of government serving some over others, ineffective and corrupt, kind of that perception of government. And then the one that we've talked a lot about is kind of negative personal experiences. And to me, each of those suggests like a different framing strategy. So the first one, is basically effective because it's tapping into that system is rigged kind of thinking, right? It's making you think that, oh, government is, you know, is out for the interests of those people, but not my people. And I think that there are a set of framing strategies that we can think about, whether that's the use of values or talking about the way that kind of public services and government are accessed and affect all of us and are key to kind of our collective, kind of a lot of these appeals to collective. The ineffective and corrupt is thinking about ways of activating kind of that more responsive role of government. And then I think the third one one's the hardest one, which is less about a communications intervention and more about an implementation intervention. But I think you can kind of use those three drivers to develop a set of communications hypotheses, which then you could go out and test in the kind of work that we do at Frameworks, which is exposing kind of different people to different frames and looking at what that does for specific outcomes that we care about moving.
So I just wanted to add, you know, on the operarization of this, I think it is the framing and messaging and narrative. But as you know, Nat and I talked about, it's not just a communications, you know, narrative change. Government also has to operate differently. And so the way the partnership we're thinking of this is, how do we come at this from a communications lens? How do we continue to research this? But what are the ways that we can be partners with government to help them, you know, reform, whether that's, you know, in how they're delivering services, how they are communicating as leaders, how they're more effectively, you know, delivering for the public. So I think there's also a way that government has to be a partner in this, right? And we also need, you know, political leaders to help invest in those reforms to get us to the government that we need. You know, the messaging can only do so much, but if government isn't showing up in the way that we expect and deserve, you know, trust is never going to improve.
Just to drill down on that question for a minute, I mean, you make the point, this is not just about perception or marketing, it's also about like substance. Do you know from each of your surveys, or are either of you in the field now or going forward to understand not just the categories, like is it a matter of attitude or efficiency or whatever, but whether they're actual entire blocks of types of services, maybe emerging services that people feel government isn't even doing at all and should be doing? Are there things that people want government to do that it doesn't do now?
Yeah, no, I think that is something we want to explore in partnership and future research. You know, we looked at kind of what are the top, you know, priorities for government. And so we got kind of broad strokes, again, more accountable, more transparent. That means a lot to different people, right? Like, and we need to dig into, like, what does accountability really look like to the public and who we're trying to influence? What does transparency mean? Because, you know, government puts a lot of data out there, but clearly that's not breaking through, right? They want, you know, government to be more efficient. So what does that look like? So I think that's something for us to drill down further in future research for future surveys. Nat, I don't know if there's anything you want to add from your lens.
No, I mean, I think this connects back to the conversation we were having about AI as kind of like an emerging function of government that's really interesting to think about, and obviously really careful to get right, because it's full of traps and holes that we can fall into. That's the only thing that I would add.
Right. Have robots do more was not one of the top answers in the last survey. So a couple of questions from the audience. Manali Kulkarni asks, what are the communications and narrative opportunities for change when it comes to addressing stigma that is associated with using public benefit programs? And Manali, I don't know if you can clarify. I'm not sure whether that question means how can government help people not be stigmatized, or how can government play a role in making the public less resistant to paying taxes to fund public benefit programs. But do you see a role for employees and government in this area, where public benefit programs intersect with stigmas around welfare?
I'll start. I mean, like, we need another couple hours on that one, because it's so important and I think complicated, obviously. So to me, there's like a clear thing we don't want to do, and then maybe a couple of things that we do want to do. And so one of the things we really don't want to do is either explicitly or unintentionally fall into this trap where we are activating people's proclivity to think about deservingness. So any kind of time we use the D word, deserving, even when we're saying that it's not important to think about, we are activating that tendency that people have to evaluate who deserves what, and who should get what goodies. And so one of the things that we really actively work with partners on is steering clear of any and all cues that invite people to start evaluating the deservingness of individual people or groups of people, because that, again, unintentionally activates the very stigma that is kind of asked about in the question. And instead, I think the general narrative that we want to advance is this idea, these aren't my words, I don't know who they came from, but they're definitely not mine, of like what everyone needs, but only some people get, this kind of targeted universalist frame, where we're talking about the things that we all need and rely on, but making the point that those services, that those needs are not kind of evenly distributed across the population. I actually think that we've talked a little bit about kind of like the last 3 years. I think that there's a lot of examples, COVID in the last 3 years, that show or allow us to kind of advance those target universalist messages, the kind of common challenges and needs, yet the way that things like pandemics don't equally or evenly affect groups of people in this country is like a really good opportunity to use some incredibly still relevant, I think, examples to help make that point and advance that larger kind of what everyone needs and only some receive, only some get frame.
Sam, any thoughts on this?
No, I think Nat covered it wonderfully.
Elizabeth Green asked a question. I don't know if anyone will have data handy, but I think at least in broad strokes, maybe each of you could address this. Elizabeth asks, do you have a sense of which demographic groups are the most movable on the issues in terms of where they are now and where they might get? And I know you had mentioned, Sam, that you had found that there was actual movability among some respondents. And I think Nat's findings on that sort of societal framing about whether something is paused or changeable by individuals versus whether it's systemic, that does suggest that that might be a different answer to this question now than it was even 5 years ago. But to Elizabeth's point, do we know which groups are movable and how they're movable and why?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. We, as I shared, we focused on, again, those that identified center right, center left, and independents. And that's a wide group. And we didn't get down, versus to the specificity. We looked at some regions, as I shared, those that lived in the American West. We saw high potential for shifts. But, again, saw opportunities, particularly those identifying on the center right, as opportunities to shift perceptions. We saw the most favorability, in focus groups and other messaging that we did, which I think that's a great opportunity. And from there, I think what we need to do is get down and look at different demographics by gender, by race, by region of the country, to Margaret's earlier point, urban versus suburbs versus rural areas. So we have some more work to do to unpack that, but that is giving us, some hope about where this future of this work could go.
Great. We have a question from Pete Tontillo. Given all of the findings that we've been talking about, which do you think is the most important area of research to be focused on next? And that might be a different question for Sam than it is for Nat, and you might already be in the field, so you might be able to answer it, not based on what should be happening, but actually what is happening. So I leave it to both of you. Sam, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. Pete, thank you for the great question. Gosh, I feel like this work can go into so many different directions. I think a lot that's come out of this conversation and something that's been on our team's mind is getting down to those services and unpacking that more about where the positive and negative interaction is happening and how can we shift that through the interactions. I also think around misinformation is a huge, place of research I'd like to explore. How is misinformation affecting views of government, views of civil servants? What are the opportunities to try and combat that? So I think there's a couple different areas that I would love to move forward in. This research is so full of great data. It's kind of like hard to pick and choose. Like, I feel like we could spend so much time going deep. Nat?
Yeah, I'll try to limit myself here, but I think like the answer to that question, Pete, is in a lot of the things that we've said in response to either your questions or Margaret questions. So Samantha you've served Samantha in particular, Margaret, a lot of why questions. And I think that that's a really fruitful area of research. So the descriptive kind of research that we're talking about is great in giving us a sense of like what's going on. But as a qualitative researcher, my question is always why. Like, why is it that people's reaction to services is so much more positive than their reaction to leaders and politicians? So I think there's a set of why questions that can be kind of fielded through some research. I think it's also important to repeat the kind of work that Samantha has presented longitudinally over time. This is not one and done kind of work, and the value of this kind of work accrues when you have repeated times at which you're gathering those data, which starts to give you some idea of the why. And then I think there's just a whole line of research that's prescriptive in nature around framing. Some of the work that Samantha has presented does kind of look experimentally at what happens when you vary the message, but there's a lot of work to be done in kind of working from the research that Samantha and I have presented to a set of framing and narrative hypotheses that we want to explore and test.
We've been talking for most of this sort of Q&A part of the conversation about kind of the relationship between the public that uses government services and how federal departments or agencies or employees can think about it, being responsive. I'm curious about the other piece of this, which is recruiting and retaining people to come and work in government. You don't have to even know all of this data to know that there are reputational challenges with being a federal employee. There might even be safety challenges with being a federal employee. And if perceptions of federal employees are bad, that means it can kind of be a sort of a miserable work experience potentially. So we also have been in this era of quiet quitting. We're also in an area where nobody wants to come to the office anymore, which you kind of have to in some government jobs. So whether your current research addresses it or just going forward, is it becoming more difficult to recruit people to work for the federal government or not? And are you thinking about how any of these findings would apply to recruitment and retention challenges?
I'll jump in. I mean, this is at the foundation of how, when the partnership was started, of how do we get that next generation into public service? And Margaret, as you shared, roughly only 7% of the federal workforce is under age 30, versus almost 23% in the private sector. So this is a huge challenge for our government. And those numbers have been hovering in that percentage going back to the Obama administration. So this is a long-standing challenge for our government. And you're right, the brand is not necessarily attracted to particularly Gen Z. And it should be. There's no other place you can imagine, the scope and breadth of opportunity to make an impact. And Generation Z and millennials, that's what they're looking for. But they're looking to go to nonprofits or, work on the Hill or other places. They're not necessarily turning to government. And so part of what we've been doing with this research is really sharing, educating with not only federal communicators, but with HR departments about how can they use this to think about how they're repositioning and talking about what it's like to have a career in government. And there's such an opportunity right now with all this investments that different agencies have. There's a huge hiring boom. And so how are they going out there and making government really an employer of choice? But it's not just the brand, going back again about the system, we have to make it easier for government to recruit and hire quickly, right? And then once they come on board, what's the experience that they have? These are individuals who are used to and wanting to work at private sectors or nonprofits. So how can government compete? So I think that's a real challenge, and there's really good work being done, at the Office of Personnel and Management, Office of Management and Budget to look at this. But that is something that's top of our mind of how can we use this work to get that next generation to serve.
Great. We have time for maybe a couple more audience questions. I have one from Cindy. I don't know the answer to that. I sort of know the answer to it, but there might be a bigger answer to it that one of you can share. Does the federal government have anyone or any one department that is exclusively devoted to messaging? Obviously, every department's got a comm shop and they're trying to spin their boss and make them look good. That's what my people deal with every day on the other side. But who in the federal government is aimed at messaging about the federal government writ large? And do they interact with either one of your groups is the question.
That's a great question. I mean, there is not a chief communications officer for the federal government, right? So this happens, in the communication shops, Margaret, as you mentioned, across agencies. The Office of Personnel Management works from it as they're thinking through how they message and talk about the brand of government to recruit talent and engage talent. But this is a challenge for the comm shops, as you said. A lot of their day spent on the reactive, pushing out the policy, and they don't really have the staff or the bandwidth to take on the more proactive messaging that's needed and the more storytelling. And so I think this is a challenge and an opportunity for our government about how do they focus really on tending to the brand and thinking through, together, what are those messages that will help resonate to the public and shift those perceptions.
So as we get ready to wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you about a question about civic education. Journalists, when we're feeling good about ourselves, think about what we try to do every day as ongoing civic education about issues as they emerge. Places like my new institute at Syracuse are devoted to the idea in part that a citizenry that better understands how government works, how news works, how all these things work, can make better decisions if they're better informed. But have either of you in this research or going forward, have you been thinking about the role of civics education? I don't mean this as a marketing or messaging thing. I mean this substantively, about the role of civics education in helping people to understand what is it realistic to expect out of government? What is it not? What's the role of the federal government? How does that intersect with the Constitution? And if you do think that civic education is important, how do you think it is important? Is it more important in K through 12 education? Is it more important in terms of continuing education for American adults? Sam, you first.
Okay. So, this is not something we have dived too deep into, and something we haven't really talked about too much in this conversation is the role of trusted messengers and other organizations. And I'd put this idea of civic education and academic, institutions in that. I mean, I think that's critical and something we, as you said, have to do a better job of. And that, I've been thinking about what are the organizations that are out there that we could potentially partner, share this information with, so that they can then take it and, apply it to their programs, their own research. But that is something like back of my mind, top of my mind. I might move it forward now, Margaret, with your comments. But that's something I've been thinking of, is because, again, this is a huge problem. The government is our largest democratic institution, and there's other entities, messengers that need to be involved. And I would put the civics kind of groups and civics education as part of that. But Nat, you might have more to share what you're thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking about something that's trust me, it's related, although it's not going to sound related. So I'm thinking a lot right now about science, trust in science, and science misinformation. And there's emerging really interesting work that connects people's kind of science literacy and science understanding. The higher that is, the less susceptible they are to misinformation. And so I'm kind of sitting here wondering if there's a similar relationship that's at play between kind of understanding of government and democracy and susceptibility to misinformation. So that's one, I don't have an answer to it, but when it comes to science, that connection is emerging as really powerful. And I think it'd be super interesting to kind of see whether that holds when it comes to thinking about government and democracy. And the other thing that I think is a really important part of this conversation that we actually haven't talked about very much is that D word, is democracy. how much of this conversation is about government, a lot of it, and how much of it is more generally about people's understanding, like your question, Margaret, of kind of the democratic system and how it works and who does it and what needs to change for it to work better. And so we're doing some work right now in the Culture Change Project that's looking specifically at kind of the cultural mindsets that people use to think about, make sense of, and kind of formulate opinions about democracy. And I'm not pitching another event, but it'd be great, Samantha, as you're doing additional work, and we are, to kind of look at some of these questions that we've gotten from Margaret and from the audience, and kind of see whether we can return to some of this with some new information, and I don't want to say answers, but some new information.
Real quickly, but as we wrap up, what happens next for each of you in terms of how you continue this research and how you apply it? And I think about it in terms of the calendar. There's a debt ceiling moment. There's a do we default moment coming up in short order. There's also, you may have heard about it, a presidential election cycle taking shape right now. This is probably a whole other session, but depending on who wins that general election could depend on, how quickly there may or may not be efforts to touch Schedule F or civil service jobs or any of that kind of stuff. What are the deadlines on the calendar that each of you is watching, and what's your next wave of research or advocacy?
Margaret, I mean, you kind of touched on, a number of those milestones. The debt ceiling, I think, is, a near moment in time where we're going to look at public confidence in government and civil servants. You talked about the election next year. The partnership, has for over a decade now worked to help ensure a smooth and peaceful transfer of power, so a presidential transition. In our last survey in November, we asked some questions around, trust in the presidential transition process. And that's something we want to continue to study over time. Trust, that it will be carried out peacefully, trust in the role of civil servants in that transition. And I think that will be so critical as we head into the 2024 election cycle. We want to continue to do, a big national survey on an annual basis, but we also want to do smaller polls where we can get more real-time information. So, thinking about government and public servants, after the debt ceiling, maybe looking at, as these investments are going out, are we seeing any shifts? How are people showing up? So looking at more timely topics and, just doing more research and working with different organizations like frameworks to figure out ways that we can partner and think through this work. It's an emerging area for the partnership. So a lot for us to learn from others and continue to influence how we study this.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is less immediate and probably satisfying than Samantha's, but our work is like long-term culture change work. So we're certainly attuned and interested in the two very pointy points in time that you're talking about, Margaret, but our perspective is much longer, and we're looking out and kind of have as our question of, can we shift some of these mindsets over the next 10 years, 15 years, such that the context on which we're making decisions is different than it is now. And I would say immediately, though, we are looking for other partners like the partnership, like Samantha, who can kind of see some value in the work that we're doing and can use it in the more immediate work that they're doing to kind of think about narratives and how to be optimally responsive to some of the challenges that we're seeing in relation to those two events that you talked about, Margaret.
Great. That takes care of it, not only for me, but for the audience questions. So I want to thank both of you for including me in this conversation. And with that, Sam, I will turn it to you to close your program.
Thank you, Margaret. And Margaret, thank you again for moderating our conversation. Thank you for asking all those important why questions. As Nat said, you gave us a lot to think about for further research, further conversations. So thank you again. And Nat, thank you for sharing your critical research, and to your team for your partnership on this event. Really looking forward to this partnership long-term. Again, there's a lot I think we can learn from each other. And a big thank you to the partnership team for supporting today's event. wouldn't be here without their important research and work. And a big thank you to all of you for attending today's event. As Nat said, trust in government is an essential part of maintaining a democracy that works for all people. And trust is also essential for the government to be able to reform itself and improve its own functioning, as we've shared. And so we really appreciate your time today, your interest in this important topic, and we look forward to engaging with you all in future events and research. As Nat said, we welcome the opportunity, both the frameworks and the partnership, in speaking with you. So please reach out and take care. Thank you again.